right, good day and welcome. I'm so excited to dally with Emily Dickinson with you. Get into some dallying, get into some pondering, get into some considering. So let's go ahead and get started. There we go. So, Emily Dickinson is actually almost an unknown poet in her lifetime. By some, she's considered to be the greatest lyric, a lyric poem being a brief poem with one speaker who expresses thought and feeling, the greatest lyric poet of all time. She wrote over 1,700 poems. Currently, there's about 1,789 that are accounted for. She was considered to be most productive during the years 1862 when she wrote 227 poems. In 1863, she wrote 295 poems, and you can sort of see the list there. I don't need to read it for you. And then she wrote poems every year thereafter, but was never as prolific as during this time period. Only 4 poems survive from before 1858, when a then 27-year-old Emily set about accumulating her poems and binding them with thread into the handmade volumes that were commonly called facsimiles. And that's how she put her poems together. This is Dickinson's homestead on Main Street in Amherst, Massachusetts. And in the second-story window, later in her life, she became a bit of a recluse and would sometimes even just lock herself in the room and not let friends or family even come in her bedroom. She lived at home with her father, her brother, and never married, and remained unmarried her whole life. That does not mean that she did not engage in love and that she did not fall in love. In fact, she had a few different lovers, male and female, but in one of these windows, even though there was a time when she wouldn't go out of doors, except for in her own garden area in the back, she would stay abreast of what was happening in the neighborhood, looking out the window, sitting in the window, conversing with passersby, especially children. And she would often put a little basket on a rope and pulley it down for children to get treats out of. So critics, there's a split view of Emily Dickinson among scholars and literary critics. And there's so many different ways in which different scholars and critics approach her writing. So one is that some use Dickinson's life to explain her poetry, so art imitates life. Some use Dickinson's poetry to explain her life. Art explains life. Some subject her to psychoanalytical labels, such as a helpless agoraphobic trapped in her father's house, and that could go with the psychoanalytic labeling. Some interpret her poetry through a strict puritanical lens. Others see her as a victim of patriarchy. And still others find LGBTQ plus homosexuality, bisexuality, lesbianism in her life and writings. Well, let's go back here for a second. So it's completely up to you, right? You can see that there are so many ways to approach any author, but particularly someone like Emily Dickinson, depending upon how someone chooses to analyze and interpret the literature, one can take any sort of view one cares to when looking at it. So, I said earlier that only a few poems were published during Emily Dickinson's lifetime. And most usually, Dickinson did not title her poems, and early editors assigned titles. Most use numbers or the first lines as titles, and you'll see that typically I do both. The thing with using just the numbers for a poem title, it depends on what edition of her poems you're reading, because different editors will assign different numbers to different poems. They aren't always the same. That's why I tend to cover both bases by using the number of the poem along with the title, the first line as the title. Some of her poems are unfinished, while others seem to be drafts. So of the poems that were collected after her death, that's sort of where they are, from finished to unfinished to drafts. What this also proves difficult for critics is that there are multiple versions. There's more than one version exists for a number of poems, which makes it difficult for the editors to determine which poem should be used, which poem was the best version of the poem per Dickinson's perspective. And so you can see that what's sort of beautiful about this is that we have a record of Dickinson's writing process, and that might mirror much of what we do. How many times do we write and rewrite and revisit and update poems? Her sometimes idiosyncratic spelling, punctuation, and word choice can distract readers, which also proves problematic for editors. Should they modernize things or leave it alone? And I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on this. If you think that we should not edit for today's language and today's punctuation, today's capitalization rules, but leave it for what she's doing. We know that even when there are grammar and punctuation rules, that creative writers, poets especially, play and toy and bend those rules, right? And so if she's making a stylistic choice in capitalizing a word and it's providing emphasis for her in the meaning of her poem, then should we change that or not? So when we think about Dickinson's attitude, despite living in seclusion, Dickinson was an incredibly passionate individual. And she felt intense emotion and all of the emotions, just like everybody else. Here of her life, she writes in a letter, quote, "I find ecstasy in living. The mere sense of living is joy enough," end quote. She also said she saw poetry as an exalted calling, as seen in her perspective on poetry, where she says, quote, "If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold no fire can ever warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only ways I know it. Is there any other way?" And I'm curious, as you're reading her poems, we talked about this before, if a poet or an author is going to speak about writing, I'm always going to ask those same questions and their same perspective and their same sort of demands of authors. Do they live up to it themselves? Is this how you experience her poetry? And I'll be curious to hear your thoughts in class. I want you to really hear this. I know people are going to want to do an autobiographical read, and sometimes that's going to work out, and sometimes that fits, and that's a whole literary criticism on its own, and it's a lens through which we can look through any piece of work. But is it also limiting the work of art if we only view it as being expressive of this one person's experience? And does that also diminish Emily Dickinson's literary poetic prowess? And so I want you to recognize that she adopts a variety of personas in her poems, that the I is not always or ever, you're going to see a quotation in a second, referring to her. And so you want to think about who is the I, right? Who does the I? Whom does the I represent? So here's another quotation from Emily Dickinson herself. Quote, "When I state myself as the representative of the verse, it does not mean me, but a supposed person," end quote. This is so important because we rarely get to ask poets, especially poets writing during Emily Dickinson's time, about her intent, her hopes for her writing, right? But here she is saying herself who the I represents. So I think we need to honor that, right? I think it's really important too that we see that there are times of levity, that Dickinson also expresses a whimsy and a sense of humor in her poems. Often her tongue is in her cheek. She's poking fun. She's being playful. And I think sometimes we see these photographs of her, we see these images, and we think that she's so dire and serious. But she wasn't that. She was so much more. So the Dickinson style, you're fired, that punctuation, what punctuation, how she's doing it, she's doing a free-for-all when it comes to punctuation, right? And I think that it's fascinating. And to be fair, there weren't the same sort of structures and grammatical and punctuation and capitalization rules in place when she was writing as we were writing. But she still distills and eliminates and sort of takes inessential language and punctuation. She removes it. She gets rid of it to get to the heart of things, right? Gone missing. She omits helping verbs and connecting words. Incomplete. Sometimes she drops endings from verbs and nouns. And then say what? Unclear pronoun references. What are the its? What are the thises? To what do they refer? She leaves it up to us to determine, right? Under pressure, she's compressing language. Grammar schrammer disregards the rules of grammar and even sentence structure as we're used to seeing it. Rhyme time, she varies her rhymed use. She uses identical rhyme, which is the use of the same word as a rhymed pair, putting the words stone and stone, or time and time, at the concluded positions in two lines. Many poets frown upon identical rhyme as being unartful. However, it can add emphasis to a poetic passage. In medieval French verse, this fashionable technique was called rhyme riche. True rhyme, also called exact rhyme or perfect or full rhyme, is rhyming two words in which both the consonant sounds and the vowel sounds match to create a rhyme. So the term exact is sometimes used more specifically to refer to two homophones, each of two or more words having the same pronunciation but different meanings, origins, or spellings, that are spelled dissimilarly but pronounced identically at the end of the lines. Even words that are spelled dissimilarly can rhyme because poetry relies on the sound of words rather than on the spelling. Examples include pain, like the pain you feel, and pane, a window pane. Time, as in the movement of time, the passage of time, and time, the herb. Reign, like horse reign, and reign, the reign of a monarch. bow and bow, new and new. So you get the idea. An I-rhyme is rhyming words that seem to rhyme when written down as text because part of them are spelled identically, but which are pronounced differently from each other in modern language. Examples include forth and worth, come and home, kind of, right? Bury and fury, stove and shove, ear and bear. So the pronunciation of certain words has varied from century to century, and in the 1400s, English underwent radical changes in the pronunciation of vowels. Similar, less dramatic changes have crept in through pronunciation in later centuries as well. For instance, in the 16th century, the words room and Rome and loom were pronounced similarly to create a rhyme. It would have been room and loom. In later centuries, the 17th and 18th centuries, as literacy grew more common, literature poets employed I-rhymes to display their familiarity with the written word, and also because poems were more frequently published than orally performed. Vowel rhyme is another way to describe assonance, rhyme in which the same vowel sounds are used with different consonants in the stressed syllables of the rhyming word. Penitent, reticent, so access, after. A slant rhyme or imperfect rhyme, also known as inexact, approximate, near, half, off, or suspended rhyme, are rhymes created out of words with similar but not identical sounds, such as with down upon or eyes and images. In most of these instances, either the vowel segments are different while consonants are identical, or vice versa. Inexact rhyme is used for intentional effects and was popular with postmodern British writers after World War II. So I know we just took a little time out on rhymes, but I think it will benefit us, and you can keep all of this in mind as you're reading other poems for the class. Certainly Dickinson was a trendsetter. With her lack of structure, her varied rhyme use, she leads the way and opens the door for modern and contemporary poets. She is rejecting the strict, formulaic way of writing and constructing poems, and providing a new, refreshing take on things. Riddle me this. Dickinson's style can sometimes make her poems incomprehensible to some and more riddle or puzzle-like to others. And many think that she's in a sort of space of poetic obscurity because they think that the seclusion may have contributed to her, to this sort of idea of a poetic obscurity, that she might have had private meanings for words and symbols. So think about different languages, second nature language you have with people who are really close to you, with your comrades, your friends, your lover, your family, these sort of inside ways of speaking and understanding words. And that people outside of that circle may not be in on the joke or be in on the understanding in the same way. Some see her poetic obscurity as coming from something of that nature. Hum the hymn. She uses meters of English hymns when she does use more formal poetry in the sense of having the rhyme and the meter. And of course, it wouldn't be Emily Dickinson without what? Without her dash. The dash has lots of, plays many different roles. It can provide emphasis. It can indicate a missing word or missing words. It can replace punctuation. It can serve as an elongated comma, so a much larger pause. It can connect ideas. It can continue on. She often uses the dash at the end of a line. And So you're left to determine, does that mean that this idea continues on? Does it end? Does it continue to the next line? Does it go beyond the next line? Is it just a long pause? Is there an idea missing? Are we to sit and ponder? So lots of fun stuff happening with the dash. Some call Dickinson the poet of dread, and I'm so curious as to whether or not you think that this is an accurate depiction of her poetry. In what ways might she be a poet of dread? Does she write about life or some aspects of life as if something to be feared or dreaded? Does she arouse fear and dread in her readers? Or does the phrase mean something entirely else entirely? And is she addressing topics and issues in a way that is more frank and forthright and forthcoming, allowing space for people to work through things that they might not otherwise? Is she exploring themes of death and life and nature and religion and all sorts of other topics in a way that allows people to face truths and existential questions? And so is it dread in a negative sense, in a positive sense? Does it even fit her? So I want you to think on that and come back with that. So here's, we're going to go through some various themes in Dickinson's poems and what critics have teased out about her poetry, and see how it might apply to some of the poems that we've read and that we'll discuss soon. So I want you to consider some of these questions, and I think we can pick up with this during our discussion. But I don't think I need to read all of these questions to you out loud, but I really want you to think about this concept. Can we know joy without understanding pain or disappointment? Does having experienced pain, struggle, disappointment help us to appreciate moments of ecstasy and joy more? This next question is interesting to me. Does the pain of separation indicate the degree of our desire for union, whether with another human being or with God? So this concept of separation, and earlier I mentioned that some people like to do a puritanical reading of Emily Dickinson's work because there are sort of remnants of puritanical point of views in her culture and society in America while she's alive and writing, and she certainly would have been informed and socialized by church and formalized religion. But think about this concept, especially in light of her own experience and the way she lived her life. This concept of separation and the human need for connection. And do we see her working through this in her poems in a way that helps us all to work through what we experience as human beings? And are any of the poems that we read that might have fit into this category, and maybe this whole Select Society might fit here. Take a look and see what you think. As we move forward, I'm going to be sharing assigned poems that are in the English 242 class, the second half of American Lit, and then also when I teach 241, the first half of American Lit. So please don't feel like you have to read all of the poems on these slides. Just think about the poems that were assigned for your particular class. But if you're so inclined, I do encourage you to read more of Dickinson's poems because you'll just be more enriched if you do. So God and religion. Dickinson was preoccupied with humanity's relationship to God as well as with the nature of God. What's really quite interesting, I just mentioned about her puritanical surroundings. Per her own writings in journals and letters, she came close to being converted once, but never felt God's call in the way that was described to her in the churches and in the religious perspectives of the time, the theological perspectives of the time. And that left her feeling disquieted. As a result, her poems range from friendliness to anger and even to bitterness when it comes to the spiritual. She also sometimes depicts God as indifferent, while other times as being cruel. And ultimately, some say that she was just as much a nonconformist with religion as she was with the writing of her poetry. And I'm curious if there's any poems that we read that might fit within this theme. And so you might think about these two poems as being suited here, and might take another look at the poem for your class with those ideas in mind. The inner world. She's very much an explorer of inner worlds and psychological states. And I think you can see this in the themes, the action, the words and ideas in her poetry. She very much presents a drama of individual consciousness in her poetry. And I also want to ask you, Adrienne Rich says, I want to ask you what you think about, if you think, in what way, how does Dickinson's poetry, quote, tell us that the intense inner event, the personal and psychological, is inseparable from the universal, end quote. And that's Adrienne Rich's estimation of Dickinson's poetry. And I want you to think, does she do this? And I think it's fitting that we're discussing Whitman and Dickinson so close together, because you will, I think we can see some elements that we've been discussing about Song of Myself also in Dickinson's writing. And which poem do you think she explores the inner world? And then I think you can see that there. So, when it comes to love, Dickinson biographer George Wisher notes, quote, Emily Dickinson was the only American poet of her century who treated the great lyric theme of love with entire candor and sincerity, end quote. That's high praise. And I really want you to think about this and contemplate it and determine whether you agree or disagree or come to something different. Whether she rejects or professes love from love and all the expressions of love, the emotion, but also the physical, sexual passion of love, whether she rejects it or professes it, Dickinson's expression is intense. And I think you might find that she treats love with candor and sincerity in these two poems. So how is, when we get to death, we're getting into some really neat, deep philosophical probings here. And I think Dickinson absolutely prompts us to go there. So just in general, how is death the ultimate experience? And is it the ultimate experience? How can it reveal ultimate truths or realities? Can it make clear the nature of God and or the true state of the soul? And Dickinson held common Puritan beliefs that the way a person died indicated the state of the soul of the person dying. And so there's an interesting correlation there, and I want you to keep that in mind when you're reading her different poems. What's really brilliant is throughout her poems, Dickinson personifies death in many different guises, many different shapes, many different forms. So it's really kind of spectacular. If you haven't seen, there's a television series called Dickinson on Apple Plus. And it's got 3 seasons, and it's pretty spectacular. It's pretty spot on. There were a couple of things that I hemmed and hawed about just a little bit, especially in the first season. But for the most part, it's pretty on target. And the actor playing Dickinson is phenomenal. But the reason I bring this up, especially here on this slide, is there are examples of death personified in that show, and I think it's so beautifully, artfully, and creatively done, and I think it parallels and exemplifies Dickinson's perspective as expressed through her poetry just spectacularly. So do take a look if you're so inclined. Immortality is often related to death, right? They're kind of 2 sides of the same coin. My puppers is here and she wants to participate in this recording. So Dahlia, please, sweetheart, that's a little squeaking there. So here's the poem, a couple of poems. And if you get the chance, because I could not stop for death, that poem, so in the television show I was telling you about, each poem is a title of the poem is the title of the episode. And then the episode works out how Emily Dickinson might have come about fashioning that poem. It's so creative. It's just so, it's like a beautiful piece of magical realism, the television show. But some of these poems are in that show, and I love how they're presented, and I hope you have a chance to look at it and find and discover it if you like it as well. Nature. So to Dickinson, nature can be a source of joy and beauty. It can also become threatening and dangerous without warning and cause, so be inconceivably impetuous. And at times, nature is connected with death or with annihilation, utter destruction, and sometimes nature is perceived as a regenerative or renewing force, ravishingly rejuvenating, and ultimately it can be characterized as having a detached coolness, being indifferent to humanity. And so which theme or combo of themes do you recognize in her poems? And this brings us to the end. That's all folks. Well, for now, because we have our discussion part coming up soon. And do you like my dashies there? Also, notice the theme change of the image in the slide here. I don't know. She's not so dreadful, is she? She's light and inspiring. I hope at least you find the same, because she really rocks my world. So I look forward to chatting with you in person. Until then, take